It's time for a little sadness, a little heartbreak, and a little redemption.
Let me know, that's your G, if you always will want me.
A movie featuring country music, 1983's Tender Mercies, directed by the great Australian director Bruce Beresford, starring Robert Duvall. What is this movie about? Why do I think this movie is worth watching and studying? Let me tell you, coming up next. Tender Mercy stars Robert Duvall as the ex-great country music singer Mac Sledge. This is a role for which Duvall won an Academy Award, his only Academy Award in a great and storied career. His counterpart in this movie is Tess Harper, who plays Rosalie. Over the course of the first 15 to 20 minutes, both Mac Sledge and Rosalie are going to get together and get married. Rosalie already has a son, and so Mac Sledge becomes the father or stepfather of a young boy. Now, this is a redemption or perhaps a recovery narrative. The movie begins with Mac falling down and getting sort of beat up and dealing with his alcoholism, waking up in the Mariposa Motel in rural Texas. This is run by Rosalie and her son. It's a little gas station there too. Mac offers to help her out. Soon they fall in love and then they get married. Thus begins a redemption story, but Mac has a rich and troubled past. He used to be a famous and rich country singer. He had a wife who is a famous country singer and a daughter who he hasn't seen in a long time. He struggles with alcoholism. So how exactly is he going to recover in this new life? Is this new life a life of redemption, or will it be more of the same for Mac? And I think you have to tolerate 1970s, 80s American country music, and I have a very low tolerance for this myself. However, these characters are extremely well drawn up. The movie is sparse, it is stark, it is shot at a rural Texas location, mostly at the motel. So you get the motel sort of dated look to it, and then you get the landscape, which is vast and long, and this is kind of a western. As well, the country music in this, well, Robert Duvall is a passable, believable ex-country music star. The words of the lyrics of these songs are very poignant to the movie as well, and I find that just about every scene in the movie really is about the stuff of country music. I think the whole movie is showing us where country music comes from, the culture, the atmosphere, the heartbreak, the difficult lives these people live in the American South, here in Texas, and then every scene could be 10 to 12 different country songs or the stuff of perhaps even hundreds of country songs. Now, as Mac becomes a stepfather and a husband and running and helping to run the motel, he runs back into his past. He's interested in writing country music, so one of the questions is, should he continue on or try to reboot his career, or would that bring him back to the place he was at when he got lost, when he lost all of his money, when he was an alcoholic? What is that going to look like for a man who wants a creative outlet and yet knows the temptations and threats of that world of, say, big country music show business, which we are shown in this movie, and Dixie backstage, all the trappings, the red colors of her, where she is located at, those are quite different from the motel, the homely little motel setting where Mac is now at. Would he give up that motel for another shot at country music stardom? We'll see in the movie. And yet Mac, of course, has to deal with his past all the time. People are asking him about his celebrity. Later on in the movie, his daughter comes back into his life. And at each moment, you see Mac advancing, but also going back. And so some questions for Mac, include how much is he going to be tempted by his alcoholism, for example? How much will he love Rosalie, or will he regress perhaps in his life? And this is also a recovery and redemption narrative for Rosalie. Her husband, at 18 years old, was killed in Vietnam, leaving her as a 17-year-old parent with a young son, and she's been a widow this entire time. Thus, you have the remnants of the Vietnam War show up in this movie, and they haunt the entire movie. Now, to me, I know people concentrate on visuals, but the star of the movie, one of the stars, the main features is the howling wind throughout the entire movie. Wind can represent all kinds of things in movies. Oftentimes, it's horrific or it's terrifying. It's signifying a storm, for example. And certainly that's what's going on here. The storms of life, the agony of desires within Mac, within Rosalie, and other people. Wind is also, of course, in Christian theology, the Holy Spirit. And this movie shows you a couple of scenes in church, including Mac Sledge getting baptized and becoming, say, born again, another metaphor for redemption, and thus the howling wind. I think interpretations of that compete with each other. You will hear it throughout the entire movie, especially when you have these outdoor scenes just outside in the motel, and the question of whether Mac will blow away, whether he'll go away from the motel, from his life with Rosalie or not, is a threat in the movie. Will he come back and return to her because this is his new life? The wind blows where it wants to, thus that's sort of Mac's soul, if you will, perhaps. The movie is a series of small, very quiet revelations that may end up being like the title, Tender Mercies, or dark, disturbing revelations, and there is one major incident in the movie that you're not shown but is said. But most of this movie we hear a little bit about Mac's past, and then another little bit we learn he was married before he was married to Dixie, the country star, at age 17. We learn that, in fact, Rosalie was married at age 16, and we're supposed to imagine the lives of suffering and hardship, these people being very young and growing up very quickly, and then dealing with everything around them. And yet the movie is so understated. Little dialogue, not very much of it, and a lot is shown not just through the sound effects with the wind, as I said, but through the visuals. The stark, cold, open landscape of the Texas plains, which are haunting and beautiful at the same time. Beautifully shot here by cinematographer Russell Boyd, with obviously the eye of director Bruce Beresford. Early in the movie, Mac is associated with the Texas plains, and Rosalie is associated with the motel. They will eventually blend into the motel later on, and the outsider-insider dynamic shows up, with outsiders coming to the motel looking for Mac, usually about his career, Mac being at the hotel. Will Mac be out on the open plains, as it were? If you remember the classic western The Searchers, Ethan Edwards, the John Wayne character, is associated with the open plains, and that movie begins with the indoor shots. There's an indoor-outdoor, interior-exterior dynamic. Well, in this movie, Mac become domesticated, living life for Rosalie, or will he go off into the open plains? Well, that leaves the question open for magnificent, I think, but very quiet and small final scene in which you see Mac and the boy together. And then it's just a wondrous sort of scene where they sort of inhabit the landscape, and they're out, but yet they're home. That dynamic of going out but being home is there throughout the entire movie. And then Mac wrestles with the deep questions of theodicy, or God's judgment and his will. Why does God allow things to happen? Every single character asks that question in this movie. It remains a mystery, perhaps, to them all. This movie being sort of like a giant psalm or a piece of wisdom literature from a Bible or other sort of faith traditions, and then Mac asking the mysterious question why, but never getting an answer, and yet he ends up being sort of at least a believer or born-again Christian. So this movie honors the faith of the characters while asking these gigantic questions that seem to be unanswerable. I love the very natural and realistic feel of this movie. It feels like it's happening or as a recording of what happened in the past. This may be sort of a neo-realistic movie set in, the American South, directed by an Australian director, so that's interesting. And Robert Duvall's performance is very understated. We know him from Tom Hagen in The Godfather. We know him as the Great Santini, and probably most famously as the guy who's shouting about napalm in Apocalypse Now. This is quite a different character, and yet it's so believable and interesting and captivating. All of these actors are really doing fine work here. So for that reason, I think the directing, the acting, and the sound, this movie does pretty well. Hopefully you have a high enough tolerance for American country music to deal with this movie. If you do, I think you'll find a lot of touching moments in here, tender mercies, as it were. What do you think of this movie? What do you think about this analysis? Let us know in the comments. Please subscribe for more great content. Thank you. Have a great day.